So this is the interview with Harvey Brown, beginning now. And Harvey, what I would like to ask first of all, could you just hear a little bit about the very first paper you did on the disturbance theory of the uncertainty relations? You remember that very first paper you did?
Of course I remember, Michael. Well, I had done my first degree in physics in New Zealand, as
yes.
you know, at the University of Canterbury.
Yes.
And I came to Chelsea College to look into philosophy of science, sort of generally.
Yes.
Because I felt I wanted to do something that related philosophy with physics, or science in general. And so in the first year that I was in Chelsea, I studied under Heinz Post in the philosophy of science, and Don Gillies in probability theory and the history of philosophy, probability theory and the history of philosophy, and John Dorling, the history of science, and of course Moshe Machrover for logic.
Yes, oh yes.
And then when I started to do the thesis work, I decided that I didn't feel I had much of a voice in philosophy of science, but I wanted to go back and try to understand something about quantum mechanics, which I'd never really understood as an undergraduate.
Oh yes.
And fortunately, John Dorling was very interested in the foundations of quantum mechanics, so I started working with him.
Yes, oh yes.
For a while I worked, the first part of my thesis, of course, was on so-called insolubility proofs of the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, which were not, of course, insolubility proofs, but that's what they were called, and I sort of, that was my really sort of first research work in the foundations of quantum mechanics. And then after you'd arrived, we started working on the disturbance theory of indeterminacy, and looking at these classic arguments in the foundations of quantum mechanics, principally the gamma ray microscope argument of Heisenberg.
Yes.
The logic of this, and even after many, many years of thinking about the foundations of quantum mechanics, I still find this particular issue one of the most puzzling and difficult areas in the philosophy of quantum mechanics. And I was very, very happy to work with you on this subject when you first arrived at Chelsea College, and it was a marvelous experience for me, Michael.
Right. Well, what I would like to talk a little bit about Heinz's treatment of first-year students. He used to terrify them, quite frankly, and I don't know what your reaction to that was, but he was very blunt with them, you know.
He was a very, very interesting man. He was a hard taskmaster. He had very interesting, very, very informal philosophy of science classes. And I remember doing an essay for him. So I imagine I did several essays for him, but one was on the hour of time in statistical mechanics. And I got very interested in this. And I remember being very, very upset because I couldn't convince him as to how the hour of time emerges in statistical mechanics, given, of course, that the fundamental physics is time reversal invariant. And I was basically following the line of Ehrenfest and others. He was very skeptical, and I remember coming away from one of these supervisions very upset. Now I think he was probably right. But he was hard, but he was fair. And yes, he did have a reputation as being very, very tough-minded. And I think in some ways perhaps a little bit too much, because the group that I started in, I think I was the only one of that incoming group in 1971 that actually finished it as a PhD. But it was a very, very lively department, very, very high standards, and I think it was, all in all, I was very, very lucky to be in it. And of course, the other thing too that was absolutely important in the training at Chelsea was the importance of the weekly seminar, Michael.
Oh yes, yes, oh yes.
Which was really, it was really the highlight of the week. It was the, Heinz Post took it extremely seriously. We had wonderful speakers. He himself was a phenomenon to behold in the seminars. He had an absolutely uncanny ability to see the weakness in any argument.
Oh yes.
You remember, even in subjects that he was not an expert in. And for the rest of my life, and I'm sure I speak for others, Simon Saunders, for example, who was a student, came into the department at the end of my time there, and who's, of course, become a great friend and now a colleague in Oxford. I think we all feel that the seminar was something that was very, very influential in our thinking about how we go about our professional business, and we've tried everywhere. When I first went to Brazil, for example, I tried to set up something that was along the lines of the famous Chelsea seminar.
Well then, with regard to John Dorling, he was quite a character, and he was officially your supervisor.
Yes.
And particularly during the examination, he was very keen on getting things absolutely right. And he used to go on 2 days, I believe. In your case, it was 2 days, I think.
Yes, that's true. That's absolutely true. It was a tough experience. I'm happy to say that, of course, the external examiner was Bernard Despagnan.
Oh, yeah.
And I was very happy to say at the end of that trial that I was able to get the thesis through without a single correction.
Yes, oh, that's very good. Well, I would like to say something about the work you've done on relativity, and particularly the question of the dynamical versus principle theories of relativity, and that ties in with what you say in your book, and particularly I wanted to ask you about Muller's attempt to justify criterion for length interaction, for example, by showing that they are dynamically related to forces in the rod. Do you remember this work of that was Muller's work? And you don't actually mention it in your book, but it's quite an interesting bit, I think.
Yes, this is the author of the textbook on general relativity. Is that?
Well, yes,
Muller?
I think you mentioned it in your physical relativity book, and
Yes.
You talk quite a lot of different people about it, but you don't actually mention Muller's work, which I thought it was quite important what he said there.
Well, Michael, I did read Muller's book, and I think I did cite it on the odd occasion in my book, but I wasn't aware that he was defending a position that was extremely close to what I was defending, or if I did, perhaps I didn't cite him enough. But the book really came about because when I came to Oxford and I was teaching in philosophy of physics, because as you know in Oxford we have this joint undergraduate degree in physics and philosophy, and every year we teach a bridge subject, and in the second year we teach a course on the introduction to the philosophy of special relativity. When I started teaching this course, I didn't really know much about relativity. I'd done a small introductory course in New Zealand, but I didn't really understand it very well. And there weren't really any terribly satisfactory textbooks for a systematic introduction to the foundations of special relativity. There were, of course, some wonderful books, much more advanced, like Michael Friedman's book on space-time structure, Roberto Turetti's book on relativity and geometry. But these required a considerable knowledge of differential geometry, and certainly this was more than the students had, and in fact it was more than I had at the beginning. So I decided I would look into a more historical approach to the foundations of special relativity, and in particular the background to Einstein's 1905 paper. And in the meantime, as I was teaching this course over several years, I taught myself a little bit of differential geometry, so eventually I could come back and introduce these more refined approaches to, if you like, or more geometrical approaches to special relativity. And in the process of doing this sort of semi-historical, semi-conceptual work on Einstein's original 1905 paper and trying to figure out what he did that hadn't been done by the ether theorists, I came to the view that despite the many strengths of the differential geometric approach, there was also a certain loss of physical insight.
Yes, oh yes.
That led me to spell out a little bit more the difference between a constructive versus a principal theory. These are, of course, This is Einstein's terminology. And to try to defend something more along the lines of a constructive version of special relativity, but not of the geometrical kind.
Yes.
And I came back, I had started writing about this in various papers, and I realized that this was very close to what John Bell was saying in his famous, I think it was 1974, 1976 paper on how to teach relativity. And so I collaborated with people like, particularly with Oliver Cooley, and we tried to develop this idea, this dynamical approach to special relativity, and then in particular to apply it to general relativity, which John Bell had not done. And so the last chapter of my book is really an attempt to show that the dynamical approach to special relativity fits in satisfactorily into the foundations of general relativity.
Yes, well, it was very interesting, your book. But could I turn for a moment to what you did with Catherine Brading, and the paper you wrote with her, and particularly noticed the second theorem, for the generalized Bianchi identities, and the thing is, this led to the idea of underdetermination of relativity, interpreted at gauge theory and so on. And what's your view on this question? What do you feel should be said about that?
Well, when we started this work, Catherine wanted to do a doctoral thesis under me on symmetries, and of course I had heard of Noether's theorem, and I discussed it with another of my graduate students, Jiva Anandan. I didn't know much about it, and I was completely unaware of the fact that there was more than one Noether's theorem.
Oh, yes, yes.
And Catherine, who was a marvelous graduate student, we basically learned this stuff together, and she was the first to point out to me that there was a second and indeed even a third Noether's theorem. And so we set ourselves the task of trying to understand what these, well, not just the second theorem and the third theorem, but also, precisely what the first theorem meant.
Oh, yes.
And the nature of the connection between symmetries and continuity equations and Noether charges, conserved quantities, and so on. And how different the second theorem is, where now you're looking at these so-called local symmetries, such as general covariance, general relativity, and the gauge symmetries in electrodynamics. And there, of course, the connection between the symmetries no longer lead to conserved quantities, but to these generalized identities.
Oh, yes.
It was basically just trying to sort out exactly what these identities meant, how they worked in general relativity, and why, for example, Noether attracted so much attention from Einstein in particular, who had sort of anticipated in 1916, he basically anticipated a special case of Noether's second theorem in general relativity. And the second theorem still hasn't had possibly as much attention paid to it as it should have. I mean, the first theorem is widely known, the second theorem much less so.
Yes, well, that's very interesting, and I think at this point the interview with Harvey Brown is ending here, so now I just switch the thing off.